I must have driven them all away there, Chad. They all left. You don't have a bell, do you? Why don't you tell them about the food and stuff?
Before we get started, just remind everybody, at the end of this session, we'll have lunch provided. Also, Brother Mosher mentioned a poem that was up there just briefly. We've got a copy of that with a sheet attached to it that has the 10 stages of grief. So as he's getting started with this session, if you want to raise your hand, I'll get around to everybody. And Miss Karen is in there making some more copies for us. So if I run out, then we got more coming.
Can you hear me back there now? Okay. Who can't hear me? The little girl up here's got her hand up. I said, God, I hurt. And God said, I know. And I said, God, I cry a lot. And God said, that's why I gave you tears. I said, God, I'm so depressed. And God said, that's why I gave you sunshine. I said, God, life is so hard. God said, that's why I gave you loved ones. I said, God, my loved one died. And God said, so did mine. I said, but God, your loved one lives. And God said, so does yours. And I said, but God, where is he now? And God said, mine is on the right hand. Yours is in the light. I said, God, it hurts. And God said, I know. When someone that we know has lost a loved one, preaching job, a job of any kind, it's natural to want to comfort that person. But sometimes, when we're offering words of comfort, and because we have not been taught some things about these kinds of words, we can actually harm the situation in which the person at that moment is finding himself. In fact, it can hurt the person. After I said all those platitudes to Doris, she said, "But what about me?" I think I said, "He's in a better place," not knowing that I offended her. Better than being with me? For a person who's grieving, and you may not accept what I'm about to say, but it's the truth. Here, where the person is better for that person who's grieving than being on the other side. I didn't know that offended folks that are grieving. I do now. One of the things I would avoid in any conversation with someone who's grieving is judgments about the deceased person or his behavior or anything else. I heard a person at a funeral home say one time, "Well, I'm glad it's you and not me." I guess that person thought it was comforting, but it wasn't. I never order around a grieving person. Here's what you should do. Here's how you should act. Here's what you should feel. I don't ever ask them to help. They're not in a position to help me at the moment. One day a student went with me to visit the hospital, and we visited a man in an intensive care unit, and he was hooked up to an oscilloscope and all these bags hanging and all the drips going. And this young man had the audacity to say as we were leaving the room, "Now if you need something, don't fail to call us." When we got back to the car, that boy heard a sermon. Oh man, did he hear a sermon. I said, "Son, I don't want you ever to say that again to a person in a hospital bed. Ever." I said, "Who's going to mow his grass? Get his groceries? Run errands?" "Well, I don't know." I said, "You are." I took him by the house, told the lady why I brought him. She said, "Well, the yard does need mowing." That's the first thing he did. That person you know is in the hospital, who's mowing his grass? Who's getting his groceries? I would really like to know why we announce who the sick are from the pulpit. Somebody tell me the reason for doing that, other than the fact that people get angry if you don't announce it. Does anybody intend to go by and help the person? Does anybody intend just to be there? Preachers, when that call comes that somebody's died, you get over to that house right now. And it's a terrible thing to walk into that house as a stranger. Why haven't you visited before? I've been around people who told me, "My preacher's never visited me." I said, "He's not your preacher, and you ought to be grateful he isn't. If he were, maybe you could train him. Certainly God hasn't." We're just there. So, preacher, you get over to that house and tell the person, "I'll answer the phone for you." Just sit there and take messages. They won't remember that the phone rang, let alone what the messages were. If you can, go to the funeral home with them. Insist on it. We have some unscrupulous funeral directors out there, and you'll be able to figure out who they are, because when somebody's grieving, they usually pay too much for the casket. In 50 years, even in a sealed box, what do they call the thing, a vault, the body is dust, folks. But folks don't understand that, and so sometimes unscrupulous funeral directors take advantage of them. That's where the preacher can help. And never, while I'm thinking about things I shouldn't do, never put a time limit on somebody's grief. Please, I talked about that when I first started. Time heals everything, you know. Not this, it doesn't. In fact, what we need to start doing in order to endure this grief is planning for the time when his birthday comes around, or hers, or the anniversary comes, or Christmas, or Thanksgiving. All the times when everybody was together and there was a lot of good time, they become painful periods. We need to learn to expect that. It's coming. And that way I won't be so overcome that I can't function. Here are some things not to say to somebody who's grieving. You'll get through it. Just be strong. You'll get through it. I'm not through it yet. Be strong how? Don't cry. Don't grieve. How many of you remember the funeral procession that went by Jacqueline Kennedy and little John and Caroline? You remember those pictures? Was she crying in public? Typical American expectation at a funeral. Be strong. Big boys don't cry. Big girls don't cry. Be strong. The biggest man that ever lived, the best man that ever lived on this earth, wept at a funeral. We had a teacher one time who actually told the students that when they did a funeral, they were not to cry because that would be unprofessional. I guess the Lord was unprofessional because he cried at a funeral. You'll get through it, be strong. I would avoid that kind of a statement. I'd stay away from it. It offends the person. Years ago I got a call that one of my friends in Memphis had a heart attack, a preacher friend. So I went up to the hospital, and here he was sitting in the middle of his bed smoking his cigarette. And I had a hard time having sympathy for a fellow who brought a heart attack on himself. But I certainly would have never said to him, you brought this on yourself, it's your fault. But I've heard that statement at funerals where somebody says to the person, he brought this on himself, it's his fault. He's in a better place. Yes, but I'm not. Here's one I hear it sometimes when people will tell me that after they went back to work, they'll hear something like this. Aren't you over this yet? It's been a long time. What does that say to the person? What are you really telling them? Forget him. Get over it. Or this one. Now, when I die, if I can possibly do it, I want all of my family and all of my former students around my bed, and I want every one of you to be crying. Oh, we're going to miss Brother Keith, except for his tests. I want you to miss me. I don't want you to get over it. Well, Keith lived a long time. At least he didn't die young. Well, there's comforting words. How do you like this one? Doesn't he look natural? No, he does not. You know, this is one that was said about my grandson's death. God must have wanted one more baby in heaven. God doesn't need another baby in heaven. Out there where that little body's buried, when we buried him, he was the last in the row in what's called Babyland out there at Memorial Park in Memphis. But now there are about 20 rows behind him. So many babies die just because God needed another one in heaven. God must have wanted her there because she's such a good person. Maybe if she hadn't been so good, she'd still be alive. My daughter-in-law's mother said this to her when James died. Cindy, you're young, you can have another one. That is even said by well-meaning people. They don't mean any harm, but what they don't realize is what's happening to the person grieving when there's a miscarriage. Well, after all, that's a death, folks. That's a loss. That's a grief moment. Here's the one that said the most and should never be said. I know exactly how you feel. I know exactly what you're going through. Oh, you do not. What did I say about grief? It's what? Unique to every person. Every person does it differently. Here's one that I have never thought about. And Dr. Wolford, in the seminars I took, kept insisting on this one. He said, don't say to the person, I'm sorry. Because the grieving person, if he's in that stage of anger, can think, why are you sorry? You didn't do anything. Maybe I could say, I'm sorry about your loss or something, but even that doesn't get across what we're trying to say to the person. I avoid using the word sorry when I'm talking to somebody who's grieving. First of all, I could get down in the pit with them. How do you like this one? You know, when my father died, here's what and boy, I really felt bad, and I'm still, and why are you down in the pit with me? Couldn't you kind of lift me up? We start being remorseful around a person who's in total remorse. Try to avoid that kind of conversation. Here's one. Everything happens for a reason. Is anybody in here a Calvinist? What's a Calvinist? That's a guy who believes what a 26-year-old Dutchman wrote in his Institutes. And he has nearly destroyed Christianity in the minds of many. He believed that everything that happened, God did it. Everything, God did it. We have another extreme called a deist. He believes God created and doesn't interfere at all in this world. Doesn't even pay attention to this world. Just sort of wound it up and let it go. Right in between there is the truth. God providentially cares about us. He cares. Angels care about us. The Lord does. The Holy Spirit does. They all care about us. But when we get into the area that everything happens for a reason, sometimes, folks, there are accidents. A Christian can use the accident, use the situation, James said, by taking the trial and learning to be steadfast from it. We can learn how to use the trial. We can't get over the trial. I have a friend who used to hold, when he was living, conflict resolution seminars. When he told me that, I almost fell out of my chair laughing. I said, you actually tell people how to resolve a conflict? Oh, yes. Interesting, I said. At what point do you erase their memories? He said, what? There are people who try to teach grief resolution. The only way to resolve that is to erase my memory. Because as long as I remember the one that was lost, I'm going to grieve over that situation. As long as I can remember him. I will not forget it. I told you that earlier. I'm not going to forget it. I said, why don't you teach conflict reconciliation? He said, why? I said, what is man's greatest problem? Somebody tell me what man's greatest problem is. Sin. Has the problem ever been resolved? No. How did God deal with the sin problem? He reconciled it. A God-man satisfied God's justice and man's iniquity, the problem of it. And so it's reconciled, not resolved. Isn't sin still in the world? So is death. So is grief. I cannot resolve that. All I can tell you today is, whatever you're going through, it's normal, and you will get through it, but the problem is, it's so painful and so filled with suffering and anger that all I can tell you is what I would tell you every time I saw you at the funeral home. And this is the best line I know to say to someone. Notice I didn't write them up there because there's nothing dogmatic about this point. All these kinds of things, I'm trying to avoid harming the person. But to me, the best thing I can say to someone who's grieving, I put my hand on that shoulder, or this one, wherever I'm standing. John, I've been thinking about you. And that's it. That's it. Nothing else. If I said anything else, he wouldn't remember it anyway. But he'll know one thing. I touched him and I was there. Have you ever been after the funeral and people come around, did you see so-and-so there? Was so-and-so there? Was that person there? If you're there, that's what's important, not what you say. But try to avoid saying something that would harm the situation. Here are some things you could say then. Tell me what you're going through. Let that person tell the story to you. Instead of saying, I know what you're going through, say, tell me what you're going through. Let him be part of that conversation. Now, sometimes, and I have an article here by Billy Bland. It was in the Gospel Journal. It's called A Parent's Worst Nightmare. Jared Bland was killed when Jared was 19 years old. I remember the exact day it happened, and I drove down to Coldwater. Karen, you're from Coldwater. Where is Karen? And you're always in hot water when you were there, is that right? Coldwater, Mississippi. I drove down there, and just to be there, went to the funeral home with them. Immediately, I started talking to Billy about Jared. Tell me about him. He was willing to talk, and it helped him, he told me years later. Terry didn't talk about that boy for 3 years, would not mention him. Well, we know what she was going through. No, we don't. You ought to get over it. No, she shouldn't. Did you ever get mad at Job's wife? When you read that line she said to him, why don't you curse God and die? What a terrible thing for her to say. Wait a minute. She lost all her children, everything she ever owned. It's all gone. She's living in misery. It's as if a tornado went through. And she's upset too, isn't she? At least Job, like every husband, didn't say, yes, dear. Job said, I can't do that. The Lord giveth, and now he got his theology wrong. He believed it, but he got it wrong, and the Lord taketh away. We know from reading the book, it wasn't the Lord that took it away, it was Satan. And so it is that we just there, and that's all we could do. But while we were there, no, I'm not going to tell that. I already said about I'm so sorry for your loss. That's something I could say, but I think I would leave out the word sorry and just say, I'm here because you're going through a loss. I'm here. One person I heard was a 13-year-old girl who said to a lady, I wish I had the words to help you and to comfort you. I thought, that's interesting. That's a very mature young lady. Just telling the person, I don't know what to say. That boy used in the hospital room. Preachers, listen to this one. We can reach a lot of people when they're going through this grief process because it's a change in their lives. But if we say something to them like this, now, if you need me, I'm just a phone call away. I don't ever say that. Ever. I'm going to go by there that day after the funeral and the next week and so on until I can sense that whatever I could do, I've done. A thing that I'm told people like to hear is when you say to them, I have such fond memories of her, and then mention one. I like to do funerals if I can be very personal about the person. The hardest funeral to do is when you don't know the person. But anyways, just be personal. That's all right. You can say, I remember that she always baked me an apple pie. I remember that. However, sometimes it backfires on you. Sister Wilhite, I visited her over a 10-year period, probably 150 times. I did her husband's funeral. I did her oldest son's funeral. Now, you have to be careful with people is all I'm saying here. Every time I would visit her, she'd give me a cup of coffee. Now, that coffee was so strong, Bobby, you could stand the spoon right straight up in it. It would just stay there. Well, it wasn't quite that strong, but it was strong. 10 years, words hurt. One day she said to me, I notice you never finished the cup of coffee I gave you. Stupid me. I said, it's kind of strong. She stayed angry with me for a year. So I know that words can hurt folks, right? You have to be careful what you say. Just be careful. Just that you're there is great. I'm your friend, you could say. I'm here for you. That'd be a good one. And one fellow said, if you can't think of anything to say, a hug might be appropriate. And most of the time, you don't have to say anything at all. Just be with the person. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 15, 52 through 54. Chad, would you read this for us? 1 Corinthians 15, 52 through 54. Yes. The only being who has actually changed the meaning of grief is Jesus. Without him, there's no hope. He changed the meaning of it, at least. Did he change the process? No. He went through it with Lazarus. In fact, he went through it with himself. He was in the garden. He knew he was about to die. And the Bible says his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. I asked my medical doctor's son, what in the world is Matthew describing? Or Luke describing? He said, Dad, if I understand that wording correctly, that's hematidrosis. I said, what in the world? Oh, hema, that's the Greek word for blood. I got that part. What in the world is hematidrosis? He said, when there's great trauma, I'm talking about my medical doctor, he said, when there's great trauma, sometimes the capillaries under your skin break and the blood comes out the pores. I said, what happens to people if they suffer that great a trauma, car wreck or something? He said, they go into shock. Did you notice in that text the angels came and strengthened him? I wonder if that's why they came. He was in agony because he was in a human body. He was suffering. And I notice in his prayer, he said, Lord, if it be possible. That's humanity, isn't it? If it be possible, don't let me go through that. He had to go through it anyway, even though he asked. Christ has changed the meaning of grief. And yet, and these are for your notes, and then I'll stop. There are 5 huge myths about grieving. I want to talk about them, and then I'll stop. Now, everybody knows that a myth is a female moth. So when I use the word myth, I don't mean Myth Jones. I'm not lisping. These are things that people believe, but they're not so. These are the 5 great myths about grieving. The first one, and especially in this country, that grief and mourning are the same experience. Most people use the words grief and mourning in the same way. They use them synonymously. But if I want to be a helper to those who are grieving, I need to understand the difference in the two. When I use the word grief, I'm talking about your thought processes, what's going on in here, the internal meaning of what's happening to you. Mourning, however, is the external expression of it. And this too is unique to cultures and individuals. If you've ever seen a documentary of a Near Eastern funeral, a lot of wailing, loud noise. Down in New Orleans, down in New Orleans, they have parades and they have bands, and everybody mourns differently. A good way to remember it is mourning is grief gone public. But we sometimes try to judge a person's grief by his expressions outside, and that's not always the way you can do that. In fact, it's never the way you can do it. Some people cry, some don't. Some scream, some don't. And so when I say to a person, carry on, keep your chin up, get over it, keep busy, you're stopping them from mourning. Why are we in this culture so averse to mourning? Why don't we like it? Because if we get involved in it, then I've got to be part of the helper group, and sometimes I just don't want to do that. But I want to tell those of you something here today. It's all right to mourn. Go ahead. And don't let anybody stop you. Don't just grieve, mourn too. And be proud of the fact that God gave you the capacity. Allow yourself the luxury of mourning. Myth number 2. We talked about the stages of grief, or phase. I'd rather call them phases. And I gave you a list there of 10. Did you notice? And there's one group that teaches 7, so take your pick. People are going through all of these things, but there's a myth that once I go through these predictable stages, and they're not predictable, but once I go through this orderly process, I'll come out on the other end and I'll be all cured. 1969, when Kathleen Kubler-Ross put out her book, Death and Dying, on death and dying, she taught these stages. But the myth was that once you go through them, you're done. Not so. Doesn't happen. People die in different ways. People mourn in different ways. People grieve in different ways. And so when I'm talking to someone who's grieving, if they're in my office here, this is a psychologist's word. Teach me about what you're going through. That's a great way to help someone. Teach me about what you're going through. You tell me, because I have no idea. If I think that I'm trying to move that person from grief to solace, I'm a fool as a counselor. Grief counselors can't help you get over it. They just become an ear that says, take your pain that's in here and teach me what you're going through. Take it out here. But if I'm going to a counselor expecting to solve the problem, it won't happen, folks. It's not possible. Unless I could erase your memory. I would never describe to someone how he should mourn or grieve. It's his unique situation. Myth number 3. A lot of people believe that when it comes to grief, we should move away from it instead of toward it. Danny, for the rest of the afternoon, I do not want you to think about an orange. Do not think about an orange. What are you not supposed to think about? An orange. You just said it. I'm going to ask you at 1 o'clock. You said an orange. Why? You're thinking about it because I put that up here, right? If I think about dieting, I'll get fat. Because I'm thinking about food. Well, if I avoid thinking about this, then I'll get over it. No, you won't. Because in trying to avoid it, it's in your head. You're thinking about it. Embrace it. God gave you the capacity to cry, to feel, to hurt, all to help you endure what He knows is a loss. Did you know that the Bible calls death an enemy? It's not a friend. It's an enemy. And the last enemy that shall be defeated is what? Death. This is no friend. So, I'm grieving. Well, I'm going to try to stop grieving. How do you do that? You can't stop the process. Well, move away from it. Do something else. Get busy. It won't help. You'll just be a busy, grieving person. But there is this myth that I should try to move away from it. Think about something else. Do something else. You want to break a bad habit, well, it won't work. And those who continue in this country outwardly to grieve even years after the situation are thought of as weak or crazy or self-pitying. And the common message is, shape up and get over it. The week after my grandson died, I got a letter from a boy that I'd taught. Well, he's a young man now, older man now. And in the letter he said, now you be sure, Keith, to act like a Christian through this. Okay. I think I'll cry. That's not what he meant. Myth number 4. The goal in the grief process is to get over it. That's a myth. I've been saying it all day. I heard a couple talking about another lady, and they said, well, she should be over it by now. That's ludicrous. In many grief seminars that I've read, the last session, the man is trying to teach you grief resolution. It doesn't work. It isn't possible. I'm not going to get over it. I'm not going to have my memory erased. Myth number 5. Those who outwardly mourn are weak. Many people in this country associate tears with weakness. Why? You husbands have experienced this with your wife. If she starts crying, did you ever say, please don't cry. Don't cry. I don't want you to cry. You start feeling helpless. You can't help her. You can't stop it. Well, we don't like people who are crying because we feel helpless. It makes us feel helpless. And so we're trying to, I guess, help the person or protect the mourner from pain. And so we say something like, you know, tears isn't going to bring him back. Tears won't bring him back. Or, he wouldn't want you to cry. Oh, me. Well, it's a myth. To a person who has suffered loss, the pain changes over time. It's not an ever-present pain, usually, after a period of time, but it's there. There's an emptiness. And I'm never going to get over grieving. People who are surrounded by this myth-filled world, country in which we live, where we're supposed to be strong and get over it. When people like that are around us, we start wondering about ourselves. It makes us feel more isolated and alone when people tell us to get over it, quit crying, get busy. And because we don't know how in this country to let the person do the work of mourning, we try to stop it, stifle it. We've also stopped them from enjoying life that they do have and the capacity to enjoy it that they do have. We get in the way, we interfere with their capacity to live. C.S. Lewis wrote, "From the rational point of view, what new factor has her death introduced into the problem of the universe? What grounds has it given me for doubting all that I believe? I knew already that such things as these happened every day. I had been warned, in fact, I had warned myself and my readers not to reckon on worldly happiness. We are even told, blessed are they that mourn." Actually, that's over sin, not over death. But he says, I accepted that. I didn't receive anything that I hadn't bargained for. The problem was, it happened to me. Thank you for your kind attention. I think they're going to feed you, so there's probably food in the other room. Does anybody have a question? I beg you to come back at 1. I want to give you that quiz, and I want you to hear what a therapy session can do for you. So come back at 1 o'clock, and we'll finish up by around 1:45. Who just got into the pulpit? Oh, an elder? Well, we'll probably hear a sermon.
Not a sermon. We'll ask our ladies if they would please to go ahead and help prepare our meal. We do have plenty of food back there to feed you. We encourage you to stay with us over the lunch period. We'll reconvene at approximately 1 o'clock. But we do have a lot of food back there to feed you, and we encourage you to join us. But before we do that, we'll offer a word of thanks.
Notice that when the elders speak around here, the ladies jump. I need that power.